All right, so this is 4 lectures on the space trilogy that I used in a course in Ollie here in Prescott 6 months ago or whatever. So the title of it was C.S. Lewis, Life and Works. And this is the work we considered the most. And so today we'll go over a bit of the historical and intellectual setting of the trilogy. Watch some lectures by a professional literary expert and see what he says about them. And then I'll go over what I think are some big messages that Professor Wayland does not bring up. And before I get going, I want to show you something. If you all can see this, I wanted to show you how I read the book. So this is the book. And then if you look at the end of it, you can see I have, it looks like about, last time I guessed, it was 70 or 80 tabs. So when I read, especially C.S. Lewis, what I do is I underline any ideas that I think are kind of important, and so that when next time I read it, I don't miss those ideas. But if I come across something that appears to me it could be used in a class, I put a tab on it. So those 60 or 70 tabs are what I think are discussable issues raised, ideas, perspectives, whatever, in the trilogy. And of those, we'll talk about maybe 30 of them or something like that. So I picked the 30 that captured my eyes the last time I looked at it. So this trilogy is rich with content. Second thing is the way it came about is J.R.R. Tolkien and Lewis made a deal. They both were worried about the decline of Western civilization, and they were doing projects to try to retard that, or at least point it out to people. And they made a deal that first off, they thought science fiction was a possible genre that would be useful. And C.S. Lewis's part was to write about space travel, and Tolkien's part was to write about time travel. But Tolkien never got around to doing his. So that was kind of a loss. I would love to have seen what he ended up producing. All right. So first about the Mars, because these are trips to Mars and to Venus. About a century ago, there was a common belief in extraterrestrials. Many people believed that. And in 1877, an Italian astronomer said, I think there are canals on Mars. And an American astronomer, Lowell, picked up on that. And he really believed there were canals on Mars. And he believed that meant there were intelligent beings up there. Of course, now we know better, but a century ago, this is the context of the book, written in a time when many people really believed in it. So Lowell built a observatory in Flagstaff specifically so he could see the canals better. And he was speaking about canals on Mars a month before he died in 1916. So there was a lot of that kind of belief. Here's a whoops, it jumped. Here's a map from about that time period of people starting to say, look at all these canals on Mars. And I remember hearing it when I was a child, things like that. And then came a couple of very popular movies. And you can get these movies yet. From War of the Worlds. It's a story about the day that Earth panicked because we were invaded. And very good movies and attracted a lot of attention. And in fact, Orson Welles put on a radio show based on that, where he was doing his regular Sunday show. And then he had breaking news come in, and he acted like all of a sudden the show is interrupted to announce we've been invaded. And apparently it was so realistically done, at least some people panicked, jumped in their cars and headed away. It was in New Jersey. So that was in, let's see, what year was that? It was 1938. And that's the year Out of the Silent Planet came out. So in the same year, Orson Welles, over the radio, scared a bunch of people about about an alien invasion, and that was the year the first book came out, Out of the Silent Planet. So basically, the context is a lot of people believed in it. So this really was a note. While it really resonated with a lot of people. All right, so now there's a Hillsdale College class, free online course, an introduction to C.S. Lewis. It covers some of his apologetic works, Narnia, and the Space Trilogy, and I'm not sure what else. It's a free course. It's very good, and I've extracted the video and the interview of Professor Whalen, but he's going to talk about the trilogy from his perspective. So now's the time for Jeff to kick into that, and I'll stop share screen and take it away, Jeff.
Lewis's thrust in the Space Trilogy is less that the given natures of things are beyond the reach of our will, and more the given natures of things are so to be celebrated, rejoiced in, and wondered at. Only a fool would want to make them subject, or even dream that he could make them subject to his will. You wouldn't change a thing that you dearly loved. Hello. We're back today to discuss C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, as it is often called, although the trilogy of novels he wrote in the 30s and 40s, sometimes called the Cosmic Trilogy or the Ransom Trilogy after its protagonist, Elwyn Ransom. In fact, there are reasons to decline to refer to it as a space trilogy, reasons we'll encounter in just a few moments, but most people refer to it as the Space Trilogy quite comfortably, and that is how I will refer to it here. This trilogy of novels by Lewis consists of Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength. And as I say, he started publishing these in the late 30s and through the mid-40s. And these precede his Chronicles of Narnia. In a preceding lecture, I discussed some of the general features and thematic underlying elements in the Chronicles of Narnia, and I will do the same here with the Space Trilogy. Lewis did write other fiction. Till We Have Faces is a remarkable novel, and many of Lewis's avid readers regard Till We Have Faces as his greatest novel. It doesn't have the same kind of reputation or wide readership as these novels, however, so I chose to talk about these in discussing Lewis's fiction. But it deserves reading as well, and I highly encourage it. Also, with respect to the Chronicles of Narnia, I would encourage readers to read around the Chronicles as well. Dr. Michael Ward, who presented some of the lectures in this series, has written a remarkable book, Planet Narnia. He probably was too much a gentleman to plug his own book in his lectures, so I will mention that book here in mine. He knows more about Narnia than he's forgotten more about Narnia than I have ever learned. So highly recommend that book. But there are other good things written about C.S. Lewis and his fiction as well, and it's worth reading around. Reading the novels, of course, is most important, but reading around them as well should be done. But as I say, the Space Trilogy preceded the Chronicles of Narnia in their writing and publishing, but his fundamental purpose is present in these novels as well. and that is the rehabilitation of the imagination. Lewis is interested in telling stories. He's interested in making certain kinds of points, although those points arise out of the dynamic, the moral dynamism of those stories themselves. It's not a moral overlay, but behind all of that is his wish to tell stories, a kind of story, and to tell a story in a kind of way that adjusts or moves our imaginations off the kind of center that they presently rest upon, a center that really constitutes a rut. So while the Narnia tales establish a set of alternate worlds in which to watch their moral tests and crises play out, in this set of books, the Space Trilogy, we see these things working within the planets of our own cosmos. And in this cosmos, as thought by the character named Lewis in Perelandra, the distinction, this is a quote from Perelandra, and the man Lewis says, the distinction between natural and supernatural, in fact, broke down. The character is reflecting on some things that had happened to Elwyn Ransom and was things that were happening in the cosmos more generally. The distinction between the supernatural and the natural had broken down. And when it had done so, one realized how great a comfort it had been, how it had eased, that is, how the separation of supernatural and natural had eased the burden of intolerable strangeness which this universe imposes on us by dividing it into two halves and encouraging the mind never to think of both in the same context. That is, this character Lewis thinking about Elwyn Ransom and his cosmic experience in our solar system says the merging of the natural and the supernatural had occurred, and this is a troublesome merge. By troublesome, he means troublesome in a good way. We had conveniently separated, distinguished the natural and the supernatural and placed them in little non-communicating boxes. Okay, now I'm just doing the natural world. Now I'm doing religion or the supernatural world, and never the twain shall meet. Well, in the Space Trilogy, those two very much meet. Nature and supernature fold into each other without, however, losing their own particular characteristics. So the moral drama implicit in this union of supernatural and natural is in the series brought forcefully into our universe and even into our planet, into our nation, into our neighborhood, and ultimately even into the homes that populate the novel, That Hideous Strength. So the series also, as did Narnia, the series illuminates given realities, realities that are dumb, realities that are gratuitously given to us. And it does so with remarkable prescience, but particularly it does so with respect to the sexes, with respect to male and female, masculine and feminine. These are in high focus in the Space Trilogy in ways that are often very, very surprising. And speaking of surprising, this is in fact one of the primary techniques of the novels to begin with. In some ways, you might say the trilogy attempts to recondition the way that we look at the world by making, as the old saying goes, the strange familiar and the familiar strange. In other words, surprising. Lewis isn't trying to surprise for its own sake. He's trying to surprise for an aesthetic and intellectual and moral purpose. But this business of making the familiar strange and the strange familiar is, once again, as we saw in some of the Narnia tales, an attempt to reawaken us or make us susceptible again to the phenomenon of wonder. Now, I should add that this phrase, making the familiar strange and the strange familiar, is usually associated with the Romantics. And when I say Romantics, I don't mean Candlelight Dinner for Two. I mean those thinkers and poets and artists, say, between the latter half of the 18th century up through the first half of the 19th century. They're understood to be trying to instill in the commonplace a sense of mystery and the unusual, people very often regard this as a sort of false indulgence of the imagination. But I think it's true in Lewis's case, and in fact it was true in many of the Romantics, that they're trying to nudge the imagination. It's that business of default settings. We tend to approach things in certain ways. We're in a kind of rut of materialism. We tend to look at the world as just stuff that's out there. More about this in a few minutes. And so we need to inject our perceptions of things with a new sense of their strangeness and their mystery. Perhaps I should give you an example. In the novels, in this trilogy, the most immediate example of this, and I think a very important thematic one as well, is to introduce a pre-modern conception of what is around the world to begin with. By around the world, I mean off the planet Earth. What's out there in the cosmos? And Lewis makes the point repeatedly and emphatically, especially in Out of the Silent Planet, that the cosmos is not space. It is the heavens. There's a fundamental different default, again, in thinking of the cosmos as a heavens rather than an empty, cold vacuum. We, of course, as part of our scientific endowment, regard the cosmos as a temperature-less emptiness. It is a vacuum. It is cold. It is, frankly, the result of fascinating, maybe even beautiful, but terrible accidents. The cosmos is itself without inherent meaning. It can be appreciated perhaps for its beauty, but not for its significance, because there is no signification in the cosmos other than things are. They are by accident, and what they are is a matter of mere coincidence. What the cosmos is simply a feature of its composition, its material composition. Lewis restores in his trilogy the notion of the cosmos as a heavens. The cosmos is a peopled place, not literally with human beings perhaps, but it's filled with intelligences and life and vitality and liveliness. It is a plenum, not a vacuum. It's full. Out there beyond the earth, we have what he calls sweet influences. He even invokes the old tradition of astrology, where the stars exercise influences upon us, not so much in a deterministic way, but in a kind of affective way. The stars' influence is sweet. There in the cosmos is warmth, there is life, and the invigorating presence of intelligence. Elwin Ransom, as he's being taken to Malacandra, which is Mars, in that first novel, feels a kind of buoyance and intensification of life while he's in outer space. So the word space is not even the appropriate term in this case. And this is, by the way, why people sometimes object to the term space trilogy. It's not a space. It's a cosmic trilogy. Cosmos means order, and there's order and life and vitality out there, not coldness and emptiness. So this is an example again of rendering the familiar strange. We're familiar and comfortable with the cold cosmos. Well, we're kind of freaked out by a cosmos that is filled with intelligences and influences, even if it's a rather benevolent kind of influence. We're taken off our comfortable center, as it were. Ransom says, already it had become impossible to think of it as space. He could not feel that they were on an island of life, journeying through an abyss of death. That is, when he's in his spaceship. It's not an island of life, journeying through an abyss of death. He felt almost the opposite, that life was waiting outside the little iron eggshell on which they rode, ready to break in, and that if it killed them, it would kill them by excess of its vitality. Well, another way that Lewis attempts to render the familiar strange is through a series of what I will rather inelegantly call thought experiments. He does this a great deal, in fact, in the trilogy. He will take up something. A couple of us, just a few minutes ago, were talking about this. He'll take up something and get really quite caught up in the novelty and the strangeness of it, and he'll spend pages detailing it. Let's talk about how islands float and how that would work, and how would you scramble if you were swimming in that sea? How would you scramble on top of a floating island, especially given its movement? And what would the texture be of the tubule-like roots that penetrate this floating island and perhaps into the water itself? He really does get caught up in many of the details, but the thought experiments I'm referring to have to do with often things a little bit more significant, a little bit more of a burden. I don't mean that in a negative sense. A little bit more of a burden on the purpose and meaning of the novels. So, for instance, on Malacandra, on Mars, Lewis creates multiple rational species occupying the same planet. These species, any kind of rational being, is called a Hneu, H-N-A-U, Hneu. There are 3 Hneu on Malacandra: the Hrosa, the Saroni, and the, here we go, I will attempt to say this. I think it was written not to be said. I think Lewis is just throwing a curveball at us, but I'll take the challenge. The Fiffletrig. Try it at home. Or maybe I should say, don't try this at home, children. Anyway, these 3 species, Hrosa, Saroni, and Fiffletrig, pardon me if I spat, are very, very different. They have unique characteristics, and Lewis loves detailing their qualities. The Hrosa are, I know this is crude, but an unsophisticated summary, but they're seal-like creatures, very tall, very large, but they're seal-like creatures, and they are, I think of them as Homeric. They're poetic, and they're heroic. They love battle and heroism and martial valor, even though the only thing there is to fight is this other sort of sea creature on the island, on the planet. But they love to go fight these sea creatures and then come back and write poems and sing songs about them. It's just, it's very literary, very poetic, and Ellen Ransom learns the old solar language with them and comes to be most fond of them in certain respects. The Saroni, the philosophers, scholars, and historians of the planet, and the Fiffletrig are the craftsmen, the technicians. They're the builders. So the thought experiment in this case is not just creating an alien species, but creating 3 of them, putting them together, having them sort of interact with each other, and interact relatively benevolently, but have or be possessed of very different natures and very, very different characters. Related to that thought experiment, what would that be like to have those 3 Hneu? Related to that is the fact that this is, people might argue with me about this, but that's okay. Argument is fun. It's a prelapsarian world. Malacandra hasn't suffered a kind of moral collapse, a moral calamity, an aboriginal moral disaster the way Earth has suffered. The Hrosa, Saroni, and Fiffletrig, you don't find murder, you don't find theft and mayhem, you don't find envy and bitterness and lust. It's a world of great moral tranquility and elevation. What would that look like? See, that's a thought experiment, right? What would it look like, a prelapse? How would things work? Especially if they had to, if you introduced into that world a fallen creature, man. Elwin Ransom and his, shall we say, a little bit more fallen colleagues, Weston and Devine. In Out of the Silent Planet, in particular, there is a lot of description and relatively little plot. And he's interested in the interactions of these fallen and non-fallen beings, and asks, what would for the unfallen beings society look like? What would their families look like? How would they relate to the spiritual world? Maladil is God or the Son of God. There's a God called the Old Father, and then the Son of God, Maladil, who is, by the way, the creator of the worlds as well. Clear reference to the Christian understanding. But again, how would such unfallen beings die? How would death be experienced? Would it be a traumatic, calamitous event, or would it be characterized by some kind of peaceful transition? How would families come into being? And then, perhaps very interestingly, would there be such a thing as danger? And if so, how would that work in an unfallen, prelapsarian context? There are certain pleasures, there are certain delights that come from the confrontation with danger. Would an Edenic, as it were, world be without those delights? Would an entire species of delight have no image in a prelapsarian world? By the way, some of these lapsarian interests, when Lewis is writing these novels, he was also working a lot on John Milton and Paradise Lost in particular. So you can see some of his scholarship getting in and influencing some of his fiction as well. So these thought experiments, as I say, are part of his, I think they're fascinating to him for their own sake, but they are also part of his attempt to render the strange familiar. By the time we leave Malacandra, we're actually quite happily familiar with beings that just 50 pages earlier, say, were extraordinarily bizarre and strange. Well, in the first two novels, the villain Weston appears and represents two very powerful and different forms of idolatrous self-conceit. I'm moving on to look a little bit at Perelandra, the second novel in the series now. So in the first novel, Weston is the villain, and he is the voice, Lewis calls him, of solemn scientific idealism. He expresses a kind of crude, there in the first novel, he expresses a crude utilitarian desire to master and consume the entire universe, planet by planet, if necessary. Weston is a brilliant award-winning physicist, and he's invented this means of interplanetary travel. And he wants to do this travel, not primarily for the pursuit of more knowledge or understanding of physics, but for the perpetuation of the human species indefinitely. He thinks that endowing man with these interplanetary powers and travel will permit the furthest reaches of man's evolution and domination of the universe. This same man, however, has undergone a kind of, shall we say, conversion, because he reappears in the second novel, in Perelandra, and reappears as one who has rejected his earlier views and has risen to a profoundly dangerous and false pseudo-spirituality. Now, that is in Perelandra, Weston embraces a syncretistic universalism that effectively identifies the self, with the life force of the universe. It blends all forms of being into one. Now, this is very interesting. Lewis has an interest. I mentioned when talking about the Chronicles of Narnia that Lewis is very interested in synthesis and the integration of things as a habit of mind quite out of favor in a scientific, analytical modern age. Lewis wants to reintroduce and revalorize, as they say, the habits of mind of synthesis and connection. But those habits are prone to a kind of wild excess. And what he had done earlier in Perelandra through Weston is depicted a kind of synthesis that is not synthesis at all, but syncretistic. That is a dissolving of things into each other, not a unification, but a dissolution. So again, in his syncretism, all forms of being are blended into a pantheistic self. He rejects, quote, old dualisms, and as he howls at ransom, quoting Weston now, "There is no possible distinction in concrete thought between me and the universe." And by the way, if this sounds pompous, extreme, and outrageous, it's meant to. Insofar as I am the conductor of the central forward pressure of the universe, I like that phrase. Central forward pressure is what he says, where we simply use the word progressive. The central forward pressure of the universe, I am it. Do you see, you timid, scruple-mongering fool? He's talking to Ransom. They've been arguing. I am the universe. I, Weston, am your God and your devil. I call that force into me completely. Now, again, I'm assuming all of you have read the novel, and that moment you probably recall is when the devil takes complete possession of Weston. Weston goes into something, Ransom thinks it's a sort of seizure, but later he realized that Weston has actually been possessed, taken possession of, by malevolent spiritual forces intent on perpetuating the fall that occurred on Earth throughout our solar system, our cosmos. Weston is to act, then, as the serpent in the Garden of Eden, except this is not Eden, it's Perelandra, or what we call Venus, where another creation has begun, and there is a new Eve named Tenedril, and she, again, is to be subject to temptation. Weston is the vehicle of that temptation. He is the arguing serpent. Now, the temptation, all of Perelandra, that's not strictly true. Much of Perelandra is an account of Weston's attempt to get Tenedril to fall, to sin, to violate the one command. Again, Genesis, and there is a single command in this new Garden of Eden, and that is that Tenedril and her mate, Tor, her husband, are not to sleep on the fixed lands. Perelandra, as you recall, is an ocean world, and islands float on this ocean. But there is one, actually there are two, but for the moment we'll just say there is this one fixed land, and they must not sleep, spend the night on. They can visit that land, but they can't spend the night. So Weston's entire effort is to try to get her to go and spend the night on that fixed land, simply in order to, again, violate the decree of God of Maladil. The temptations are fascinating. They are an exercise in highly sophisticated and even tortured sophistry. Weston uses many brilliant and dashing arguments to try to get Tenedril, this unfallen being. This, by the way, has part of the character, that thought experiment business that I mentioned. How do you get a sort of unfallen, perfect being? How do you get that being to imperfect itself? And the answer is fascinating. Ransom is watching all this unfold and arguing against Weston and acting as the good angel, as it were, on the shoulder of Tenedril, and Weston's the bad angel on the other shoulder, arguing that she should violate the decree of Maladil. Ransom attempts to refute him. But Weston has all the intelligence of a fallen Eldil. An Eldil is a kind of angel, an angelic creature, and we know, of course, we recognize the allusions to Satan in our own understanding. Very smart, brilliant, can out-argue, or shall we say out-sophistry, anyone, anytime, and this is what he does. However, the most potent mode of temptation turns out not to be the sophistical reasonings of Weston. It is, as Ransom recognizes, it is rather through the shaping power of stories on the imagination. Now, remember what I said about the imagination. You're probably getting sick of hearing about it. But in fact, what happens as the temptations continue is that Weston gives up sophistic argument and moves to poetry, or rather to storytelling. And he does so because what he wants to do is change the way she, Tenedril, thinks about the world. It's those default settings, so to speak. He wants her to lose her receptivity to what is actually real, including the reality of the decree of Maladil. Do not sleep on the fixed lands. What Lewis is brilliant. What he's showing here is that in certain ways, the imagination is more morally potent even than a reason subject to folly and error and sophistry. The imagination is even more dangerously subject to misconstruction. By doing certain things we'll talk about in a second, you can cloud the imagination and render it obtuse, render it insusceptible to what is actual and real. With enough poetic coloring, in other words, Weston can weaken the force of reality on her imagination, and this, in the novel, this same coloration, as you know, comes dangerously close to succeeding. What he does is, you recall, he suggests to her that violating the command will actually render her heroic, noble, a tragic queen of this new planet, okay? And what's interesting about this isn't just the sort of vanity implicit in the, wouldn't I be great as a tragic queen, but rather, Lewis points out, the theatricality of it. What Weston does is he tries to introduce a kind of self-consciousness that can pervert and skew the imagination and turn us into self-regarding beings. And what I mean by that is he actually uses a mirror. He actually gets her to look at herself. It's symbolically very, very appropriate, very fitting. What he wants to get her to do is to look at herself as if she is not being herself, but look at herself from outside of herself in a kind of self-conscious way that allows her to start acting rather than being. Okay? Theatricality. The 20th century, by the way, many great authors in the 20th century are fascinated by a kind of hyper self-consciousness that seems to afflict the modern age in particular. And Lewis identifies that as a potent way of corrupting the imagination and leading it to fall. Well, Perelandra, you read the story, I trust, so you know that indeed she does not fall. Ransom has more work to do than merely argue, and he acts as a kind of ransom, so to speak, for her and for her husband Tor, and Venus or Perelandra remains unfallen. But an important facet of this entire Perelandra drama has nothing to do, or not immediately anything to do, with this business of temptation and the danger of a fall, but rather a dualism. It presents a dualism that Lewis says is built into the very fabric of reality itself, this business I mentioned of masculine and feminine. Sex, gender, the proper term is sex, by the way. Gender, I think, I'm a little old-fashioned. I'd rather use gender as applied to language. It's not really properly used with respect to maleness and femaleness. It's a linguistic and grammatical category, not a human one. The proper term for people is sex. Sex and the nature of man and woman, fecundity, fertility, family, children. This is at the very heart of the entire trilogy, not just Perelandra, but we see it with a particular emphasis in Perelandra. There's even more emphasis later in That Hideous Strength, but we see it first in a kind of clarity here in Perelandra. It's more than a theme, this business of sex. It's a bedrock reality to which Lewis appeals in attempts to restore our susceptibility to what is real. Especially important, this is especially important in a technological and scientific age where we, human beings, appear to have overmastered realities one by one, such that no fundamental given nature need be regarded as beyond the reach of our will. That's really what Lewis is after in the entire trilogy, to restore sensitivity to the given nature such that it is understood to be beyond the reach of our will. Now, the final volume of the trilogy, That Hideous Strength, is also the most extended, and interestingly, it occurs here on Earth, though it involves beings that Ransom came to know on some of those other planets. Its depiction of a nightmarish government agency called, ironically, NICE, the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, NICE. You'll never use the word nice. Once you read the novel, well, again, I trust you've read the novel, but you probably don't use the word nice without thinking a little ironically about it after reading this. It's a satirical but grim representation of institutionalized bureaucratic pseudoscience reaching into dark spiritual territory for despotic control of society. Or rather, it's the reverse. It's really the reaching of dark spiritual territory into pseudoscience in order to achieve a despotic control of the earth, of the world. Lewis once remarked about this very thing. What we are obviously up against throughout the story, that is, that hideous strength, is not scientists, but officials. If anyone ought to feel himself libeled by this book, it is not the scientist, but the civil servant. And next to the civil servant, certain philosophers. Science, however, is used by these officials as a tool. Lewis adds, under modern conditions, any effective invitation to hell will certainly appear under the guise of scientific planning, as Hitler's regime, in fact, did. So in this way, human society and culture is looked upon as a purely and merely material phenomenon to be manipulated, to be controlled, to be conquered, as nature is conquered and controlled by the application of scientific expertise. Somebody once told me, I've never chased this down, but somebody once told me that Bertrand Russell said, the purpose of science is to make nature sit up and beg. Whether he said it or not, I don't know, but certainly that's the spirit behind the NICE, N-I-C-E, this National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. But again, it's pseudoscience. It's not real science, and it's this pseudoscience drafted, as it were, by bureaucratic administration that seeks despotic control. Now, this is not to say that those opposed to NICE are mere rugged individualists for whom personal independence is everything. There's a war, of course, in the novel, but the people opposed, you notice that the people opposed to NICE are not just sort of individualists. In fact, the rugged individualist in the novel is held up for some criticism for this. Jane Studdock prizes a kind of sterile autonomy, and she resents in the novel any suggestion that she has duties and responsibilities to others, or even to her own nature, duties and responsibilities that are apart from or perhaps above her own will. So you see, you've got the despotic tendencies of NICE, a bureaucratic, administrative, pseudoscientific tyranny, and over and against that you have its opponents, but you also have another error, as it were, and that is this radical and sterile, I use the word advisedly, autonomous individual. Okay? There's something else. The good, the opponents that are the good, represent something that involves more, well, frankly, it's the family. It represents a kind of small community of people united by their love and their duty to each other and their duty to their own natures. So one of the most important themes in the novel, and as I said in the trilogy, is the transcending importance of one's own nature and relationships to others over and above any kind of radically autonomous will. And we see this as represented by Venus, Perelandra, now not the planet Venus, but by the goddess, or the spirit Venus, and that is the rich vocation of the sexes. Lewis focuses on this startlingly, intensely in That Hideous Strength. That is the rich vocation of the sexes in a fecund, fertile generosity. A duality of male and female that represents in miniature what he says is a fundamental disposition, masculine and feminine, in reality itself. Now, ultimately, this is the most powerful effort, I think, in the novel of Lewis's to reorient the imagination by appealing to something grounded, something given, something real. What has happened in the world since Lewis died, the sexual revolution and its postscript, probably would have been very hard for Lewis to imagine in detail, but he actually pegged it in its essence. What we tend to think of as sex, and again, by that I mean male and female, what we tend to think of as sex is mere biological arbitrarity and accident, material, consequential only in its, shall we say, unmanaged results, not meaningful in and of itself. Lewis invents in that hideous strength, well, actually the trilogy as a whole, but particularly here in this last novel, what I hesitate to call, but I will do it anyway, mythologized sex or gender. And that is, he tries to, again, bring back to the very notion of sex the idea of a warm, rich, meaningful nature. Not just warm, rich experiences with beloved people, but the gendered or sexed nature of male and female is itself replete with meaning. We, in our scientific way, tend to understand sex in a kind of thin, meaningless way that renders it subject to our controlling will. He wants to make sex, maleness and femaleness, an inherent participation in a constituent deep structure of reality itself, and therefore something given, treasured, mysterious, awesome, wonderful. So Lewis brings together Christianity and myth in lots of ways in that hideous strength. He blends. It's a mythic romp, if that's not too irreverent. There are Arthurian characters. It refers to the Tower of Babel, classical mythology, and all of these things are ordered within a kind of superintending Christianity that is anything but a dreary old religion. It is presented here as a vibrant, living extension of God himself, an extension into every facet of ordinary life. Again, the modern imagination tends to look at the world as an accidental cosmic hiccup, so to speak, largely devoid of meaning. Lewis calls upon the Western mythic imagination to combat this impoverished view. The strategy, again, of collapsing the natural and the supernatural into each other is meant to awaken wonder in us and to prepare us to see the world as an integrated, meaningful, and moral whole. And the relentless presence of nature shot through by intelligence and purpose is meant to tell us, I think, the telos or end, the object that Lewis has in mind as he crafts the trilogy. Beset paradoxically by a combination of blindness to nature and a desire to master it, the modern imagination drifts in a kind of despairing waste. It was made, the imagination that is, was made for nobler stuff. It is made to see in the nature of things a given reality, replete with meaning and spiritual import. It is made to move us to gratitude and reverence for what we have been made to be. So, if I may say, Lewis in his fiction is not so much practicing the apologetics he does in his nonfiction. Rather, he is trying to apply medicine so that the apologetics might have a healthy mind or an imagination to enter into. Or if I could change that figure a little, he is trying to nourish the soil out of which our thinking and reasoning and knowing occurs. It turns out a world of mystery and wonder is not an unknowable world. Rather, it is the only world in which any genuine knowledge is possible. Thank you.
First thing most people encounter in the WoW of C.S. Lewis. How did you come across the Space Trilogy?
I read it as a professor. I did not read it as a child. I read it as an adult. I was by that time a professor of English, and I heard students raving about it. So that's when I picked it up and read it.
Now, last week you gave us a lecture on Narnia, the Chronicles of
Right.
Narnia, maybe the most
Right.
beloved works of C.S. Lewis in a sense. Which do you prefer, Narnia or the Space Trilogy?
Well, I will condemn myself in the eyes of many viewers, perhaps, by saying I actually prefer the Space Trilogy.
Why is that?
That may be a failure on my part. It might be because I read the Narnia books as an adult rather than as a child, so didn't really fall in love with them the way most children do, most readers of the books do. But I also like the degree of theological speculation in the Space Trilogy. I very much enjoy in the Narnia tales you have great adventures wrapped around the moral dynamics of human nature, right? In the Space Trilogy you have that as well, but you also have a lot of very intense and applied speculative theological conversation and argument, and maybe that makes it less impressive as literature, but I think Lewis pulled it off. I think it works.
So the Space Trilogy is not for children. It's really for adults, or at least you need a certain level of maturity maybe to appreciate it. But is it science fiction? And I ask that because science fiction is sometimes considered a form of juvenilia. At least it's looked down upon by people in English departments, Professor Whalen. Is it science fiction?
Yes, I think it is science fiction. If we're gonna categorize it, first of all, let me say that I probably am one of those fairly snobbish literary types who doesn't think of science fiction as the most exalted genre of literature. But Lewis would disagree with me. Lewis was actually fond of science fiction and defended it and was very critical of his colleagues who looked down their noses at science fiction. Lewis thought science fiction was a kind of grown-up form of fairy tale for a modern technologized scientific world. So he liked science fiction, and he thought you could do some things in science fiction that you used to be able to do with say mythology in the West, but you really couldn't do because the West has sort of lost its taste for grand mythological conceptions of things, so which he was critical of, by the way, but he thought you could sort of steal a march, you could sneak some of that back in through science fiction. So he thought of this, I think, as science fiction. I would say it's not very scientific science fiction. You know, the science in it is pretty thin, and Lewis moves very quickly to bring in those mythological elements, even Arthurian legend and the Tower of Babel and all of it. He moves very quickly to bring all of those in the Book of Genesis, of course, to bear to the novels. It's not just a story about science and technology.
I'm going to play my geek card here and say there's a subgenre of science fiction called hard science fiction, where the science is supposed to be plausible and realistic, and you can't do anything that you can't really explain through technology. Even if it's fantastical, it needs to be kind of an explanation for it. This is not that. No. Science sometimes operates as magical, in a sense, in this world. Some people, though, say these books are anti-science. They're actually against science. Is that a fair criticism?
No, not at all. Lewis, that criticism was leveled at the books in Lewis's own lifetime, and I've read some of Lewis's responses to those critiques. Lewis is critical of something that's better called scientism, which isn't science. In fact, scientism is junk science. It's political and philosophical ideology pretending it's science, or pretending to have a warrant based on science, which it does not. So Lewis is very critical of saying that science dictates we must organize society and the world and interstellar travel, this way. Lewis is very, very worried about that. He does think that science is being appropriated by people who have political and ideological agendas that are not born out of science, but rather born out of their own wills.
Now, there are 3 books in this trilogy, obviously. Does it matter which order you read them in?
Ultimately, again, I'm not going to be a doctrinaire about this, but I do think it's better if you read them in order. Out of the Silent Planet, then Perelandra, then That Hideous Strength. I do think, of course, it's not the order in which I read them. I read That Hideous Strength first, but I think my reading was, I'm a good reader, but my reading would have been better had I read them in order.
Now, That Hideous Strength is the longest of
Yes,
them.
right.
And at the start of it, Lewis has a preface where he says this: "This is a tall story about devilry, though it has behind it a serious point, which I've tried to make in my Abolition of Man," which is a book he published a couple years earlier. And Dr. Arndt has spoken to us in this course about the abolition of man. Why do you think he tried to remake his point? If he made it in the Abolition of Man, why is he trying to do it again in a novel he wrote just a few years later?
Right. Well, there's a flippant answer to that, and then there's a more serious one. The flippant answer is, as a journalist, you know, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. You could say that Lewis was simply reiterating a point worth making. But I think, and that's true, he did think it was a point worth making again and again. But more importantly, why do it in a fictional form? A lot of people are receptive to things if they're embodied in a narrative. They fire the passions and the imagination if they're embodied in a narrative. Whereas if you present them with an argument, it might leave them cold. And the funny thing about human beings is that, you know, even if we're convinced that something is true, if it hasn't actually sort of fired our excitement, if we haven't become excited about that truth, we may not respond to it as wholly as we ought to, as, you know, as fully fleshed out human beings. You know, we're supposed to be passionate about things that are true, not just, yeah, it's true. So he wants to excite our admiration and passions about the truths that he's addressing in this trilogy.
In your lectures, you encourage listeners, your audience, to read around the Space Trilogy and Narnia. What do you mean by that, reading around these books?
Right. I meant it's not necessary at all, but if you're interested, if you like these things, there are some good things written. If you like these novels or Lewis's fiction in general, there are some good things written about Lewis and about the novels. So, for instance, last time we were talking about Narnia, one of our lecturers, Michael Ward, has written a terrific book, Planet Narnia. I would recommend that. Walter Hooper has got some good material out on C.S. Lewis. A number of others. There is good. There's some not so good stuff out there too. And by the way, I am no Lewis expert. I am an admirer. I appreciate what he's doing. But as I said earlier, my introduction to Lewis was actually through his own academic and scholarly work, his literary criticism. So there are a lot of people out there who know Lewis a lot better than I do, and it's worth reading them.
You point out in the lecture that astrology plays a role in the Space Trilogy. Are you saying that C.S. Lewis would every morning open up the newspaper and read his horoscope, or something else?
Absolutely. No, I have no idea. I don't know. By the way, I wouldn't think it impossible. Lewis was a man who enjoyed amusing himself, right? And he might get a lark. He might, you know.
Well, we've all done it.
Right. Look, I said, what absurd thing are they saying today? I think it's probably more likely that he opened his morning newspaper and looked at the Manchester United scores and the Aston Villa scores and the sports scores of the English football teams.
But what's astrology doing in this Space Trilogy?
What astrology is doing is he's very circumspect about it, and he doesn't mean it in its, you know, kind of rank superstitious way. But what he's doing is suggesting that the cosmos, the universe, the solar system, is what if all of that were filled with presences instead of absences? What if space was not empty space, but was actually a plenum? What if it was full of sort of the personality of titulary spirits and angels and spiritual beings that sort of moved and shepherded the material cosmos, which of course is a very old idea, a very old conception. It's not a conception he thinks is actually implausible or even improbable, but he realizes that that's very far from the modern way that we imagine the universe. So he's going to introduce it in a kind of circumspect way and talk about the subjective feelings of Ransom as he's first being transported through outer space, and he feels a kind of a vitalizing influence, being out in space instead of, cold and dead. It's warm and vital and filled with, as it were, the presence of benevolent beings. So this is Lewis kind of using old astrological notions of spirits and planetary influences and saying, just substitute, shall we say, angels for those spirits, and then, let's see what happens.
So he depicts a solar system that teems with life.
Life, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So you have Earth, but then you have Mars and you have Venus, and there's life all over the place. And it's not just, bacteria, it's intelligent life.
Right.
Does extraterrestrial life pose a kind of a challenge for the Christian believer? And I'm wondering, how should a Christian think about these things? We've heard stories, for example, of parents who don't want to read Harry Potter to their kids because it's witchcraft. Should we be concerned about extraterrestrial life? Does it threaten us in the same kind of way?
Right. Well, let me make a distinction. First of all, I think extraterrestrial life very definitely threatens Christianity, but not necessarily in terms of doctrine. I'm not about to pontificate about matters doctrinal, and I use my words
with great care.
Exactly. I'm choosing them quite carefully. I'm not going to pontificate about matters of doctrine, but I think the challenge extraterrestrial life would pose to Christians is a challenge to the imagination, not necessarily to the reason or the theology. There's an interesting more contemporary writer, now deceased, alas, Walker Percy, the American novelist. Walker Percy wrote a book called Lost in the Cosmos. And in that book, he does many things in that book, but he imagines a terrestrial, an Earth interplanetary mission encountering intelligent beings on another planet, and these intelligent beings, after going back and forth by radio, figure out that there's something broken about these Earthlings, and there is something not broken about these extraterrestrials. They're unfallen. They haven't committed what we would call original sin, and so these other beings ask the Earthlings. They ask them, "Did you ask for help? Did it arrive? Did you accept it?" So it's. I even wondered if Percy was thinking of C.S. Lewis, because there's a similar kind of relationship in the trilogy, in the cosmic trilogy or space trilogy. That is, you have these unfallen extraterrestrials who are interacting with fallen creatures, and what's that going to be like? How would that work? That's what I meant in part by that theological speculative imagination of Lewis.
A moment ago you mentioned the character Ransom, a main character in this trilogy. Explain the name Ransom.
Right.
It's not chosen randomly. Yeah, Ransom, though, what is he getting at here?
Right. Well, actually, he talks about this in Perelandra. The character Ransom himself says he had never imagined that his name could possibly be significant with respect to ransoming someone's innocence, as it were. He has to put himself on the line to preserve the innocence of the Queen of Venus, of Perelandra. So it's certainly intentional. It's decided, and the character himself comes to think of himself as in almost a Christ-like. He's not a Christ figure exactly, but Lewis loves to blur these lines a little bit. Being in a Christ-like fashion, a ransom for someone else's redemption, protection, safety.
Here's a line from your talk. Under modern conditions, any effective invitation to hell will certain appear under the guise of scientific planning, as Hitler's regime, in fact, did. Right. Is there a message here for 21st century Americans?
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, that's Lewis. I was quoting Lewis there.
Okay.
Yes.
My mistake.
No,
what's his message for us now?
Right. Lewis is saying, in fact, that was part of his answer to one of the critics who said, you're attacking science. Lewis replied, no, I'm saying science is appropriated by people who have totalitarian desires and agendas and impulses, okay? If in the modern scientific technological world, someone is going to successfully impose a totalitarian agenda on the world or even on a nation, the odds are, they're not odds, it's more than odds, the most convenient and potent tool they will have is to do so under the guise of some kind of scientific mandate, okay? Science is not the enemy. The enemy of science, in fact, is people, or at least an enemy of science, is people who want to appropriate it for their own ideological, political, and totalitarian purposes. That's what Lewis means, and that hasn't changed. I think we have live arguments in our own day about how we should order our public political lives that profess to be scientifically mandated, but are in fact attempts at controlling other people's. You know, Lewis, he used the word busybody, and he really had contempt and fear of busybodies and what he called interferers. Busybodies and interferers are forever trying to dictate other people's lives, micromanage the universe, so to speak. And the domain of a kind of robust, hearty human liberty vanishes in their grasp, and they tend to appropriate science as their warrant and leverage.
And that sounds like it's straight out of Abolition of Man.
It is. It is. This is a persistent concern of Lewis's, and I don't think it's any. In fact, I think the dangers have only increased.
Is this why you like Space Trilogy maybe better than Narnia, because it speaks to our time in such a distinct way?
I think so. Narnia speaks to our time, of course, with respect to human universals. You know, the moral dynamics that you see at work in the Narnia Chronicles, they have always been characteristic of human nature, haven't they? You see those same universal characteristics, certainly, in the Space Trilogy, but you also see them reflected and refracted through the prism of contemporary predisposition, very contemporary and even educated predispositions and presuppositions. So that's probably part of my preference for it.
Last question, we're running out of time. We've gone through Narnia, we've gone through the Space Trilogy a little bit. Readers who want more Lewis fiction, where should they go next?
Well, there are several other books. I mean, famously, again, it falls into Christian apologetics too, but there are things like the Screwtape Letters, that's fiction. But also, Till We Have Faces, the last novel, I think it was published in 1960. Lewis really thought that was his best work, or at least his best novel, his most serious. It's a very good, well-crafted, well-put-together novel. I would recommend that. It's a little different. It's a retelling of the Cupid, the ancient Cupid psyche myth. So it's different. Don't expect another Space Trilogy. But it's very well done, very well crafted, and there is a sort of deep structure of religious significance in the work. So, and there are a couple of others too, but I would say those two are great places to start.
Professor Whalen, thank you very much. We're out of time. This concludes week 5 of Hillsdale College's online course on C.S. Lewis. To learn more about our online courses, come to our website at online.hillsdale.edu.
What I can try to do is blast through my commentary. We got a late start, but I do have a few points I'd like to make that you might find helpful. Anybody want to comment on that? Anything? It's a bit esoteric, perhaps, for some tastes, but all right, we'll just continue then. Actually, the point that he made about what is that business about the rehabilitation of the imagination. That's why I read C.S. Lewis. I'm left-brain oriented, and I want to, incline my thinking in a more holistic and big picture ways, and imagination is one way to do it. So I really, really like to read his fiction because of that. let's see. I think we don't have to talk about that, but definitely this book is an attack on modernism. It's very much along those lines and very helpful. Let's see. So that's just a reiteration of things. Let's see, I want to just go fast here. All right, actually, the interviewer mentioned this business. It's the same issue as the abolition of man. And basically, one of the characters goes through that transition from a somewhat normal or almost regular human being into what abolition of man predicts people would get to. So I think there's more. I think Professor Whalen understated some of the significance to a Christian reader. Things that caught my attention, I really loved about the book. The story Out of the Silent Planet, going to Mars, is a story about people, one spiraling up. Ransom starts out a fairly modern kind of guy, and he bumps into these unfallen creatures and he learns from them. He becomes a better human being because of those interactions. And you can see that happen during the novel. Conversely, the other two that make that trip they can't even recognize the goodness of the creatures they encounter. And it's a very interesting dynamic. I also think that the fact these creatures are different, the one's a frog-like thing, one's a seal-like thing, that may be kind of a bone thrown to Hindu people. Hindu folks think there'll be a reincarnation. And you'll be reincarnated to lower creatures if you have some learning to do. And it could be that this novel is suggesting that in the future, there'll be some of that going on. And there'll actually be a role for us to play nurturing folks like this. We'll talk about that when we get to the books and things, but basically there's a suggestion that our afterlife has worked for us, and it's actually a beautifully crafted possibility that'll just tickle your imagination. The second book, Paralandra, the one where he's going to Venus, there's more of that. And here's one of the quotes from Screwtape Letters that gives me a clue to some of the theological speculation. This is in letter 8 of Screwtape Letters. It basically, Uncle Screwtape is advising the junior tempter, and he goes into a rant against God, basically. And part of the rant is this quote: "One must face the fact that all the talk about his love for men is not mere propaganda, but an appalling truth. He really does want to fill the universe with a lot of loathsome little replicas of himself, creatures whose life will be qualitatively like his own." And I think in the Space Trilogy, that role for us, the Bible's filled with, I have some of the scripture that mentions ruling and reigning and all that. That's what they're destined to do. The king and queen of Paralandra are going to rule Paralandra once they've finished their training. So it's I think it's pretty interesting. Here's some of the scriptures. I just pulled a few. It talks about a government. It turns out the spiritual creatures on these planet are part of, in a sense, governing. They have a governing role on these planets, and you see that. And so there's Isaiah chapter 9 talks about the government, and there'll be no end to it. So when I say there's no end to it, that tells me it's the new creation talking about. All the kingdoms under heaven. There's a possibility, C.S. Lewis has in mind, that could be all the planets in the new heavens. That, and they will be everlasting and all be rulers, connected with each other, doing things. Here's some more scripture. Daniel. The multitudes who sleep in the dust will awake sometime to everlasting life. That the Skip Heitzig is a preacher from Albuquerque, and he's doing a series on Revelation now, and I'm listening to it. And in a couple of weeks ago, he went through a list of scriptures, and he says all believers are resurrected. One, you add up all the different resurrections and different things happen. He says all believers are resurrected. What are all these believers going to do? And maybe C.S. Lewis is suggesting maybe in the new creation we'll all be participating in this nurturing of other creatures. And you say, well, where those other creatures come from? Well, maybe there's some. One of his books, The Great Divorce, says some of the people in hell get a chance to reconsider. And maybe this is C.S. Lewis's version of what will happen on these other planets. I mean, it's all speculation, but it tickles your imagination, and it gets you to think about what will my role be and how will I prepare myself for it. So in the new heavens and the new earths, we're not going to sit around playing harps. So here's some more. The Lord's people judge the world. Well, maybe it's worlds, okay? And we even judge the angels. Actually, in Paralandra, after the temporarily, Paralandra is run by an angel, but the angel is destined to be supplanted by the king and the queen after their training period's over. And the angel asked the king and the queen, after your training is done, do you want us to stay around or go somewhere else? And the king says, no, stay around. We need you. And it'll be 1,000 years. After 1,000 years, maybe you can leave, but right now, stay with us. It's a beautiful scene, and I think there were clues in Scripture that sparked C.S. Lewis's imagination to describe things for us that will make you think, wow, the afterlife is really going to be wonderful. And one of the things he says often in some of his writings is if what we imagine seems wonderful to us, we're guaranteed it's going to be better yet. And so I think he's imagined something which to me sounds wonderful, and it's going to be better yet. The whole thing is very uplifting, I think. The Hideous Strength is very much this scientism trying to take over the world and remake people. And I just wanted to show you a couple things about the abolition of man. If you haven't read that book, this is a little bit about it. Here's the Lewis model of the human person. He says there's the rational and imaginative side. This is the right and left brain part in my terminology. And then there's the heart, or the unconscious mind, in the middle. And then there's the belly, animal appetites, and so on. And he says, if we're not careful, the modern and postmodern philosophies will squeeze this out. Men with no chests. They will have nothing in the middle. They'll either be run by rationality, cold, heartless rationality, treating other people as numbers, or they'll be driven by animal kinds of things. And basically, the two spirits, or the two people that travel to Mars, and eventually one becomes error is in this direction, and the other becomes just a greedy person. So in that story. All right, but in terms of movies that depict the cold, heartless, analytical types, here's two movies that depict that beautifully. One movie called Conspiracy. It's about a meeting that happened in Austria or mountains of Germany or someplace. This is documented by secretaries' notes that were found years later. The purpose of the meeting is a bunch of heads of different divisions of government within Nazi Germany is to decide the most efficient way to achieve the ultimate solution. They're talking about how to exterminate millions and millions. Starts off, he says, when we conquer Russia, we're going to get, 8 million more Jews. We got to figure out what to do with them. And they talk about it like there's only one human around that table, and he's kind of shouted down and threatened, you shouldn't really talk that way, like they're people. All right. Oh, it's a scary, scary movie about what can happen to people, and the depiction is based on real life secretary letters. Here's another one. It's called Downfall. It's from a secretary that was in the bunker the last days of Hitler. Incredible movie. And here's one of the scenes, or here's one of the parts of the absolute total heartlessness, and the idea that an ideology can take over your mind and turn you into a hideous thing. So this is a scene. These lovely children are singing German songs, and they're all from one family. Lovely children. Because the mother cannot imagine her children living in a world that's not Nazi dominated. One night, she takes a deadly poison, and she, one by one, goes around to their kids in bed, puts the pill in their mouth, and then closes their jaw so they die quickly. Then she and her husband, because the end is near, the Allies are coming to the bunker, she and her husband go out in the open, and he shoots her, and then he kills himself. And they do that because they can't conceive of living in a non-Nazi world, and they can't conceive their children living in a non-Nazi world. That movie is so, so scary of what humans can turn into. And that idea is in the novel That Hideous Strength, that sort of thing, and also Perelandra. So, all right, so I blasted through that. Could have spent more time on it. That's kind of some of the big themes that are in the books. Then the next 3 lectures will spend maybe an hour on each of the books. First, the trip to Mars and some of the interesting spiritual aspects of it, and adventure aspects. Second one is trip to Venus, and the last one is the huge good and evil battle on Earth, plus a domestic novel that's absolutely wonderful. So, any questions? I'll just stop sharing, and I know this is very long. Sorry about that.